All right, well, let's first do a very, very quick review of the first 4 points. It's the article, The Mess That Is Elite College Admissions, explaining a former dean's perspective, Jason England of Vox. His first point was that the ways the wealthy game the system are remarkably mundane. He talked about how early decision really favors the wealthy and the well-prepared. Number two, he talked about when it comes to elite college admissions that private schools reigned supreme. The public schools just couldn't compete with private schools when it came to elite counselors, tutors, essay writers, and the way that elite private schools can manipulate their school profile to get better advantages with the elite colleges. Number three, he talked about the fact that standardized testing is extremely problematic and very contingent on person's wealth. And he said, quote, in practice, test scores, class rank, and private schooling reign supreme over all other holistic criteria. And number four, we talked about the fact that men have an unfair advantage over women, not just demographically. There's just so many more qualified women applying to college these days, but also how Division III athletics and sports such as squash and polo and water polo and horseback riding tends to give an unfair demographic advantage, particularly to the white male athlete. So let's dive into number 5.
Yeah, now let me just say one last thing, Dave. One thing. So basically what he's saying these are the things I wish people knew about the way it really worked. And so that's kind of, and later on he says, you know what? I'm done with it. I left. There were too many inequities. I couldn't handle it anymore. And he actually left and became a college professor, but that's neither here nor there. So let's handle these last 4, Dave.
Well, the last 5, I'm going to let you talk about this because you have railed against this point since the start of the podcast, and that is that rankings are arbitrary, misleading, and poisonous. And I'll tee you off by the most egregious perpetrator of this malfeasance, and that is U.S. News and World Report. Take it away, Mark.
Yeah, so one of the things he mentions here that I like, he says, the college rankings are a capitalistic undertaking rooted in junk science.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, why would you want to fall victim to the grifters out there who are waiting to prey on your sense of insecurity? And so here's what I want to say about this. There is an exploitation element to the rankings. So one of the things about the rankings people don't realize is, why do they tweak the rankings a little bit every year? To sell more magazines. It's a complete capitalistic venture. They tweak them a little bit every year. Oh, this is different so that they can sell magazines the following year. And that's exactly why they do it before that tweaking. And so let's say that they did the rankings with their numbers and their formula and it came out. I'm just making this up. UC Davis was number 1. Okay. They would not run with that because there's some intentional manipulation. A while ago, it came out who the editors to U.S. News and World Report were and how they intentionally were making sure the colleges that either they went to or their kids went to were number 1. They would rerun the numbers. And that goes back to what we talked about, how the wealthy make the rules in such a way to declare themselves the winners. A while ago, one of my former students, another Anika, she went on to go into college admissions and we met for lunch in Atlanta. And I was saying, Anika, did you see all the schools that got caught, busted fabricating the rankings? And that year, there was a bunch that got caught in the same year. It's like Wake Forest and George Washington and several. There were like 4. And her response was, I'm surprised there's so few that got caught. Mark, that's so rampant. That's so widespread. Like, this is a high stakes game. It's pretty commonly known that there's some manipulation going on here. So here's my last point I want to make, because we talked about rankings a lot. I just want to make a few more points and move on. How would you feel, Dave, if instead of you getting to pick Frida as your wife, you had to have Andrew or Michael or Kim, these are all Dave's siblings, pick who your future spouse would be? Would you rather that be the case, or your mom or your dad? Or would you rather have that choice yourself?
Oh, I think I'd rather have my choice myself. That all seems so quasi-Freudian to me.
So here's where I'm going with this. When you accept the rankings as gospel, what you're doing is you are applying somebody else's standards of beauty as to who is a good match for your personality, your temperament, what you value, and who you want to marry for the next 4 years. I'm stretching the marry example a little bit. Marry as in stay at the college for the 4 years, right? You're outsourcing your ability to decide what is beautiful to you and what matches with you to somebody else. Why would you want to do that? Let me try to make this more concrete. What if a school is ranked extremely high, but it was in the heart of the city, and you're not someone who wants to attend a city school? What if a school is ranked extremely high, like a Wellesley or Spelman or a Barnard, but you don't want to go to a women's college, you want a co-ed school? What if a school is ranked very high, like a Williams or a Northwestern or a U Chicago or University of Michigan, and you're like me, you're a weather weenie. You die when it's cold. Cold weather just repels you. What if a school's ranked really high, like a Washington and Lee, but you don't want to attend a school that's that conservative? You don't want to be around so many Trump supporters. What if a school is ranked really high, like a Haverford College, but you would die at a school that has less students than your own high school has? What if a school is ranked very high, but they don't even offer the major you're interested in studying? For all these reasons, I say, don't use the rankings as your matchmaker to pick which college you will marry for the next 4 years. Use your own criteria, and you create your own personal rankings. And that's why my challenge there on that. So we've talked about rankings before. I don't want to say much more other than to say that they're highly, highly subjective. Why is it that churches aren't ranked? Imagine if there was a ranking of churches. You'd say, come on, that's ridiculous. Some churches are more contemplative, more reflective. Some are more charismatic, and people like to express themselves. How could you possibly rank churches? Well, ranking colleges is a lot like ranking churches. Just like churches have to be a certain kind of fit for your style of worship, that's how colleges should be. So don't accept that. Now, I will say this. It's a little different looking at rankings in individual majors. That's a little different. There's still a lot of subjectivity there, but nowhere near as much subjectivity if you're looking at who's got the best computer science program or the best program in dance or something like that. That's a little different than putting the whole concoction together. Let's move on to the next one, Dave.
Well, and to put it in real terms, imagine if they ranked cars and you were a sports car, but they ranked an SUV or a minivan, or you wanted an electric car and Tesla, and they ranked a internal combustion engine. Would you think that that was relevant to you? No. If you want a Tesla, man, you go out and get a Tesla. You don't have to get a Ferrari. Anyways.
Just so the first-time listeners, Dave has to work Tesla into the podcast once a month at least. Just get his Tesla off his chest. So I just let him do it. I just let him do his thing.
Now I've got to figure out how to work in Bitcoin.
Or BIPOC.
or BIPOC. All
right, let's go. Number 6.
The next one is a quote from one of the greatest Westerns of all time. It is when Clint Eastwood sends to Gene Hackman when he's about to blow his head off, and he says, "I don't deserve this." And Clint Eastwood growls back, "Deserve has got nothing to do with it." And that's this title. Deserve has got nothing to do with it. And what he says is, quote, "Our cultural standards for what it means to earn or deserve something are extremely subjective and flexible. It is difficult to get anyone to acknowledge the luck of birth and circumstance." What say you, Mark?
Yeah, so this is the point that I brought up last week, where I say the wealthy write the rules in such a way to declare themselves the winners. Here's what he says. The wealthy define deserve to ensure that their self-interest is disguised as the greater good. The wealthy teach the middle class the checklist for college admission success. And so what does that practically mean? I'll give you some examples. Here are a bunch of things that could all be in the rankings. But if they were, they wouldn't advantage the wealthy, so they're not. So you could take a look at whether you come from a school that has a very high counselor to student ratio. Let's say 450 to 1, 480 to 4. The national average ranges from 430 to 480 to 1. And you could give student bonus points for excelling in an environment where they don't have great one-on-one counseling. You could also look at things like what's the level of poverty at the school, and you could give them bonus points in how you evaluate them. You could look at whether a school has a low percentage of teachers that have masters and PhDs. And you can say, look, if this kid is getting these kinds of scores on APs with teachers without as much training, we're going to give them extra points. You could give bonus points to kids from single parent homes. But these are all things that would never happen because you would not be advantaging the people that the system is designed to advantage. And so that's really what he's getting at is there's so many built-in things that advantage the advantage. And then here's a quote that he says, and I do want to read this because I thought it's pretty profound. He says, in other words, it's very difficult to get anyone to acknowledge the luck of birth and circumstance. To do so undermines a key cog in the American dream machine, the myth of the self-made man, which reduces wealthy children's built-in advantages to irrelevant biological footnotes while transforming others' disadvantages to their personal faults. He says it's very difficult to get those on the short end of the stick to see that diligence and acumen can take you only so far. They internalize failure and they seek out scapegoats. And then he has an example. The example he says is the black kid stole my spot. So I think we've said enough there. Let's move on to number 7.
The 7th point has really been so well encapsulated into a book that we're going to recommend again. And the 7th point is where you go to college doesn't define you or guarantee your future. And for that, Mark, I want to re-reference the Frank Bruni book, Where You Go Is Not... Oh, I forgot the title.
No, you got it. You got it right. Where you go is not who you'll be.
Where you
got
go
it
is
right.
not who you'll be. That's correct. I didn't want to butcher such a great book. but Mark, why don't you give a synopsis?
Yeah, so it's so strongly book is strongly recommend. Bruni's a, I believe he's got a Pulitzer, but he writes the New York Times. Basically goes through, he takes a look at all kinds of different people who we would think of as successful. Whether it's things like Fulbright scholars and Pulitzer Prize winners and Rhodes scholars, and he looks at things like CEOs and a whole list of different things. And then he looks at where they went to college. And while you see some of the elite schools there, it's shocking how many of them don't come to elite schools. And he makes the connection that this fixation we have with where you went to school and the correlation with life success just doesn't bear the reality. And so it's a very comforting book. I think it can really take a lot of the pressure off of kids. So it's a book that Dave and I, recommend that everybody reads. Now, I'll tell you something. As soon as I get done this podcast today, I'm doing another podcast. I'm a guest on another podcast. And it's a podcast is a student, a high school student. She started her own college podcast out of Maryland. And doing a pre-meeting with her, she's a listener of our podcast. She's like, my podcast is geared to the people at my school who are obsessed with trying to go to a top 20 college. It's like their life mission, she said. And that is so unhealthy. And I'm coming on. I said, I'm be happy to come on and address that. So I'm going from this to right to that, Dave, as soon as we get out of here to be a guest to address that issue, because that is so psychologically unhealthy. And it's also so detached from the reality of this world. And, I want to say something again about College Confidential, because I spoke out about College Confidential a while ago and got some blowback. Some people spoke up. I was like, well, it's not that bad. I find it helpful. So it's analogy time. Suppose you're on treasure hunting. You're out in the woods and you turn around and you find a $50 bill. Man, this is pretty good. And turn around again. There's a $100 bill. Wow. Next thing you know, there's a couple $100 bills. Then you turn around a tree and somebody stabs you right in the gut with a knife. That's how I see College Confidential. There are treasures there. There are jewels there. I would not ever dismiss the fact that there's some valuable intel there. But here's why I feel so strongly about it not being healthy. The overall message from those message boards is if you don't go to a top 20 or 30 school, one of the 1%ers, then you're a loser. And your life is not going to be on the same trajectory for success. And so what I see it doing is beating kids up, not making them feel good about themselves, and not being good for people's mental health. And so that's why I'm so critical of it. This is a time to me when so many things are attacking our kids' self-esteem. And we want our kids to walk around with confidence. And I see the opposite happening with the people that frequent that message board because of the toxicity, and the whole context is, what are you going to do to get into one of these super elite schools? And, and that's the whole context. And there's a comparison thing, which Dave addressed last week, runs rampant on that website. So that's why I'm not a fan. So yeah, I acknowledge there's some nuggets there, but is it worth your $100 bill, your $200 bills to get stabbed in the chest? I don't think so. I want to read a letter that one of our listeners sent in. Her name is Jessica. And just so you know, I don't want you to think if you send a letter and else we just put you on blast and throw it out there. So obviously I got her permission to read this. And this was right after episode 154 went live. So it was about 7 weeks ago. And I asked for permission. I've just been waiting for the opportune time to read it. And I think this is a good time. So here's what Jessica says. And I'm not going to say her, we never say last names, but I'm also not going to say her state because she does say some personal things in here. But if I leave the state out, she could be any Jessica in the world, right? So here's what she says. I was so happy to hear your very astute comments on the recent podcast, episode 154, regarding the disproportionate focus on elite college admissions. So much of the anxiety and the stress students and parents feel about the process could be alleviated if we had a more honest picture of the broader college admissions landscape and the great value to be found in less selective admissions. And if we reminded ourselves that there's more to our own self-worth than what school our kids got into, then Dave, she shouts you out, man. Gotta give you your props, dude. She says, Dave's comments about the fact that the vast majority of colleges in the U.S. are what would be considered less or non-competitive in the admissions really hit home for me. I was so worried about my 12th grade son's chances because his academic record's not really that strong. However, once I got out of the top rankings mindset, I personally, she says in parentheses, I personally went to one of those top 20 and Ivy League schools myself, both for undergrad and for grad school. But once I got out of that, I realized the wealth of opportunities that are out there for my son. He could really focus on what was the best school for his profile, for his interests, not what someone else thought was the best school. Now we are very, very happy about his prospects at a number of schools where we know he has a good chance of acceptance and we know he will most likely thrive. And then she says, further, for his sister, who's now entering high school and is an academic rock star, I think my approach will still be different in terms of the range of schools she should explore. We might find that she's going to be happiest, not necessarily with the most competitive school. Love the podcast. Keep up the work. Keep up the good work. So well said. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jessica. And Dave, good job, my friend. You hit that point home.
Well, yeah, the other thing I'd like to add is one podcast that I listen to a lot other than this, it used to turn me on, is the Bigger Pockets Real Estate. You know, Mark, I have a big interest and stake in real estate. And it really drives home that for so much of entrepreneurs, college is an afterthought. And for many of these kids who are just hitting it out the park in real estate, some of them have never even finished college. And the attributes that they need to be successful have nothing to do with the admission criteria for getting into these elite colleges. In fact, one of my mentors was an Irish bricklayer who started laying brick in Chicago 25, 30 years ago and now has a net worth well over $40 million and owns all these apartment buildings. And so character and work ethic and vision and personality and salesmanship and all these things that are so important to entrepreneurial success have absolutely nothing to do with what we consider college admission criteria. And it's important to keep that in mind. In fact, I would recommend people just listening to a Bigger Pockets because it just gives you the perspective that the keys to success in life are so varied and so often not found in anything related to the whole college admissions. Not to say that college is not important, but the arcane criteria that we are using to get kids into this small select group of colleges have so little relevance to the criteria for success in most of life. We got to keep that in perspective.
Thanks, David. That's a good segue because Anika and I talked about character. Well, we talked about character in bonus content last week, and we're talking about character again in bonus content this week. So Anika and I will pick that up. But let's make the last point.
The last point, the job of a college counselor or a college admissions officer isn't easy, and admissions officers do a lot of thankless work. So, Mark, you were involved in the mix. You know how the sausage is made. Let's talk to the factory worker and tell me how tough this job really is.
Well, the job is tough, but it's incredibly rewarding, you know? And I'm really glad he ended with this point because, you know, if you listen to all his points about the inequities of college admissions, you really could come away thinking, man, that sounds like a snake oil salesman. That sounds like the worst used car salesman. Who would ever want to do that? And he makes the point of how much respect he has for admission officers. You know, here's a quote. He says, to foist the task of remedying societal inequity on relatively underpaid, underappreciated admissions officers is unfair. He said, I had a huge office, a fancy title, lots of frequent flyer miles, but the salary was peanuts. And he goes on to say that's one reason the field has a disproportionate number of women and minorities in high ranking positions. And then he goes on to say, I wasn't able to make the level of change that I felt needed to be made. So I eventually left, but I have tremendous respect for what people do. And that's how I feel. I feel like it is like God's work you're doing. Like, I try so hard to get people excited about admissions. I know it's not for everybody, but if a kid was to come home and say to their parent, look, I'd love to be on the Supreme Court, or I want to be a cardiologist or something like that, people would get really excited. Wow, look at that. My kid wants to do something great. That's how I feel about it. If somebody wants to be an admission officer, like you're changing lives. You know, you really, really are, that by who you admit and who you bring into a community and who you give these opportunities to. And it can be an incredibly fulfilling work. Particularly if you love kids and you love working with students. And so most people, they're swimming upstream because these structural inequities are built in, and they're absolutely doing their best to help kids and give kids opportunities. And it can be an incredibly rewarding, incredibly fulfilling job, but it is a lot of work, and people work a lot of hours for, you're not making six figures unless you're more on the executive level. And even that's not even true at some smaller under-resourced schools. So God bless everybody out there who's in the trenches doing their best to help kids. The best admission officers, they don't see themselves as salespeople. They see themselves as counselors who are just trying to get a kid on their path, whether it's at their school or not. Those are the best ones. And God bless them. May their tribe increase.
Awesome. Well, let's put a bow on this article. I think it was a very, very, very well thought out article and gives a lot of grist for the thinking.